a lesson entitled, How Do You Know Who Loves You? Now, everybody wants to be loved. This is a natural, normal human condition. From the time you're born into this world till the time you leave it, in some fashion or another, you're doing something to be loved. By whom or by what, that's up to you. But this is a very natural, normal human thing. It's part of being human. It isn't something that we have to learn, that desire to be loved. That seems to be innate, whether we're in this dimension or another one. Not everybody knows how to go about that. I mean, we want to be loved, and let's say that that's one of our natural instinctual drives, but how do we do it? Well, even sex has to be learned. There may be the urge, there may be the drive there, but it's still something that has to be learned. Well, so does how to be loved and how to love. That's also part of being human, having to learn how to do something. Everybody does, in trying to do this, everybody does the best they can within the limits of their beliefs. So they go about it and make different approaches in different ways. And there is a kind of they try to fit their relationships on a kind of a hierarchy of love, we can put it that way. From the most ideal kind of lovingness to the barest acceptable kind of lovingness. In some way or another, they have something on this scale. At the top of the scale, the ideal, you could say, and this ideal has been brought out sometimes in love songs, in poetry, sometimes in religious mythology, but we could call this one blissful union. And in some of the Eastern religions, they talk about this blissful union. In Christian mysticism, they talk about this blissful union. The concept here is an ideal, perfect love. Well, not everybody gets that, or anywhere near that. But they try to get something close, so what they're dealing with, if they can't do that, is next step down, which would be a joyful connection. Now, that's pretty good. That's pretty good if you can get it. A blissful union, of course, you're in this tremendous state of intense bliss or pleasure or delight and feeling perfectly at one with the object of the love, or with everything if it goes that far. In joyful connection, you're feeling a state of joy, and you're feeling that real strong connectedness, like some people get sometimes when they're looking at the world and they suddenly get this feeling of being connected with the whole world. It's not the same as being the world, which is that would be a union state, but they can feel a connection between them and the trees and the plants and people and all kinds of stuff like that, and it makes them feel really good. Or if you're with an individual, person, and you suddenly feel a connectedness, and it makes you feel great, There's a joyful quality about it. That's the next step down in the hierarchy of love. And it's still very good. Third down, which more people, not a great many people in this world of ours today get this joyful connection even very often. But you may have experienced it yourselves at some time in your life. But down here, further, is one that more people experience then. Still not enough, but this one we can call happiness with. Now you have that statement that has been used, which is quite a good one for most purposes, to love is to be happy with. Well, happiness with, then, is a state, you might say, on that hierarchy of love. Whenever you are happy with a situation, a person, and it doesn't have to be a joyful ecstasy, just a happiness with. This is also a state of love. Many people don't believe there's anything beyond that. That's okay. If you can get this far, you're doing great. Now, you have an area below this one that a lot more people begin to fit into. And some of them even striving for and seeing this as a goal. This one we can call comfortable proximity. Now this is for people, let's say we're talking about a relationship, a couple maybe, friends, whatever, who feel comfortable with each other when they're near each other. I mean, they're not happy, but they're not sad either. Okay? The relationship is comfortable. A lot of marriages, again, not nearly enough, but a lot of marriages that are considered happy have reached the point of comfortable proximity. Funny thing about this hierarchy of love, sometimes you can feel like you're starting out at the top and moving steadily downward. Rarely do you start at the bottom and feel like you're moving steadily upward. It's not impossible, and it has been done. But it usually doesn't work that way, for reasons that we'll talk about. So comfortable proximity is where people are just getting along. Down below that one, they're still getting along at the level of tolerance. Okay? Not necessarily comfortable, but at least they're tolerating each other. Okay? You may have a few disagreements and things like that here, but you can have disagreements any place along here, but except blissful union. But intolerance, you're making it go. You're making it go. Down below this one, yeah, right. I'll put this one over here, though. But down below that one, you have mutual dependence. So this isn't just a case of tolerance here. Now these people, it's almost like an addiction. They've gotten into a state where they can't do without each other. Now actually you could have one-sided dependence, but let's call it mutual dependence here, with both people at the same level. They feel there's a need, they've got to have each other, they can't live with each other, they're upset when they're not with each other, they're upset when they're with each other, but they're upset when they're not with each other too. It's not so much tolerance, they can't allow someone any freedom, any bit of freedom scares them, they're going to feel they're going to lose them. There's a tremendous amount of jealousy at this point, so they're clinging together for dear life. Down below that one is acknowledgement. Now, if a person can't get anything else so far, has not been able to find a relationship of mutual dependence or tolerance or even comfortable proximity or whatever, they at least, human beings at least want some acknowledgement. They want their existence acknowledged. They want to be acknowledged that they are human beings with feelings. You know, that there is something there other than an object. And so they will, if nothing else, they will try and get some kind of acknowledgement from each other. Even, a nod. You can tell yourself, if you're going down the street, you don't have to like somebody or have anything to do with somebody. You catch their eye, and there's an uncomfortable feeling. What do? The easiest thing to do on a social basis is acknowledge in some way. You might nod your head, smile, or give some indication that you recognize that there is a presence. Looking at them as if they don't exist, there's no acknowledgement in that. This has been the case, for instance, when you have very sharp caste or class levels. Very often you will have the people of the higher class or caste not even acknowledging the existence of the ones they consider their inferiors or the lowers, for instance. And so they might talk about anything as if they don't exist. They might, sometimes even talk about state secrets if it's in that kind of a situation, or they might talk about the situations, or even the person himself as if they didn't exist. Now, curiously enough, this kind of thing comes in you see a lot of this in hospitals, where doctors are getting together, sometimes even nurses, getting together to discuss a patient. And it can add greatly to that patient's lowering of self-esteem and lowering of that patient's even will to live when here's a couple of professional people talking about that patient's illness or that patient's condition or that patient's whatever it is on the chart, and there's a human being lying there. And that person isn't even getting any acknowledgement as a human being. And they're discussing a disease or they're discussing something else. It's got nothing to do with the person there and their will to live and their love and their need for acknowledgement. All these other interactions with other human beings that the person needs. So acknowledgement is what people will reach for and try to get in some fashion. We might have added another one in there someplace, probably above acknowledgement. And maybe, not sure exactly where it would have fit in there, but we'll consider this with acknowledgement, and we'll consider these two at the same thing. Acknowledgement or approval. Okay? Approval is a little stronger. Where someone is trying to get approval. So you will have people doing things. For instance, some of the people who are doing sometimes even dangerous things, or maybe good works even, are trying to get approval from others. That kind of a love that comes from approval. Okay? So there is that level of it too. But below this, if you acknowledge somebody, that's kind of an implicit approval there too. Okay? But below this is attention. And this is the lowest one on the level, on the hierarchy. If nothing else works, they'll do something to get attention.
Hit him with a baseball.
Oh, they might hit him with a baseball bat. They might make known their hate. They might go out and be vandals, do vandalism. Yeah, right. They might do anything as long as they get attention. If they can't have acknowledgement, and they can't have approval, and they can't have dependency on somebody, or tolerance, or anything else like that, by God, they'll have attention. They'll know I exist. And children sometimes learn that from a very early age. If they can't get anything else from their parents, they will get an accident, or they will throw a temper tantrum, or they'll push over a bookcase, or they'll have something happen so that they are paid attention to, even if they aren't acknowledged or approved. Okay? It's a desperate measure. It's a measure that's done out of desperation when nothing else has worked for them. Mm-hmm. But you know, it's a funny thing, talking about all this hierarchy. Of course, right down at the bottom, I said these were ways of trying to get love. There's also the stage of giving up on that, in which you go into autism, or coma, or some form of complete withdrawal. Okay. And that's so you don't have to suffer any more the pain of not even getting attention. But all these things are very subjective. All these things are very, very subjective from the point of the individual who experiences them. Because how do you know? I'm asking you, think about this. How do you know if you're loved? How do you know who loves you? Now, if you stop to think about this one, really stop, you'll begin to realize that there is no way to know objectively, by words or action, if somebody really loves you. Now, you can have a parent, for instance, who beats a kid because the parent doesn't know any other way to express himself. And the parent can really love that child. And there may be something in the activity of the child that sets off an automatic reaction response. It's got nothing to do with whether the parent loves that child or not. If you look at it outwardly, you'd say, how could that parent love that child? Beats him. Okay? Subjectively, the parent feels they love the child, even though they don't understand what they're doing or why. The child, who knows what the child's going to decide? It'll depend on how desperate the child feels for love. or whether it gets any other kind of acknowledgments or attention. From the outside, by words and action alone, you cannot tell if someone else loves you. Just by any objective criteria. A person can say they love you. They can act like they love you. How do you know if they love you? Because there isn't any objective way. A curious thing happens. When children start to grow into a period of understanding, a little, so they can be talked to and understand, they begin to learn, one of the first things they usually begin to learn is that it's possible not to be loved, and that not being loved is a terrible thing. It's never spelled out what that terrible thing is. But boy, when mommy or daddy says, I won't love you if you do that, or I won't love you if you don't do that, and she says it in a tone of voice that really says, tells you that's something terrible. Kid gets scared half to death. They won't be loved. What does that mean? Since no one tells them, they've got to invent something. And so when I've been talking with people, and we often get into a state of talking and getting to that point, saying, what would happen if somebody didn't love you? They come up with the biggest surprise on their face and they say, I'd die. That's right. And the surprise on their face is because they know that's not true, and they don't understand where they came from. Where it came from was that childish interpretation of what could be the most terrible thing that could happen to you if you weren't loved. You'd be abandoned, thrown out, starved to death, and die. And this could be a person in a very successful career and going, all objectively having all the great stuff. But that childhood idea is there because it has never been examined. All right, so a child is taught that not being loved is possible and that it's a terrible thing. So then the child goes through a natural process. Well, I got to have some way of telling if I'm loved or not. And so the kid begins to set up some arbitrary guidelines, maybe with some help from the parents, maybe by seeing examples, maybe by listening to songs or reading books or watching movies, sets up some arbitrary set of guidelines that tells you, you've got them too, whether somebody loves you or not. And this gives birth to conditional love. And that phrase which is, if you loved me, you would do such and such and such. Or, if you loved me, you wouldn't do such and such and such. These guidelines have been set up so that we know when we're being loved and when we're not being loved. And so that tells us when to get angry, when to get upset, and when to be happy. You each have your own set of guidelines. It's important for you to realize that you created those guidelines. They are yours. And you want to keep those guidelines, that's fine. Just recognize that they're made up. They don't correspond to any cosmic law whatsoever. You could change them, you can keep them, you can modify them, you can throw them all out. You can add more, you can do anything you want. Just recognize that they're yours and you made them up. So the girl who gets angry because her boyfriend didn't remember her birthday has a rule that says, if you loved me, you would remember my birthday. So the guy that gets angry because his girl didn't meet him after work, even though he didn't tell her, has a different rule, which says, if you love me, you would be able to read my mind. Oh, you'd be surprised how many people have that one in some form or another. Okay? And these are all rules that people have set up so that they can know when they're being loved and when they're not being loved. Well, you know, anytime you set up a situation in which you create conditions for loving and being loved, you're also setting up potential conditions for losing that love, for falling in and out of love, for getting mad at people or resentful or angry or upset or fearful or whatever. And the only thing that's doing it are those conditions that you set up. If you start reducing the number of conditions, you'll find yourself having more love and giving more love, because you won't have so many restrictions. And if you ever decide, and this is possible to do, if you ever decide to throw out all the conditions, you've got that incredible phenomenon known as unconditional love. Love without any conditions whatsoever, with no demands made on you or the other person to love or not to love. This puts you into a state of loving and being loved all the time. And it's just your conditions or lack of conditions or throwing out those conditions which has done that. Because now this is a very profound statement. Listen to this one. It's just as reasonable to suppose that everyone loves you all the time, and that all their actions in regard to you are their best expressions of that love. They're expressing that love the best way they know how, whatever they do. It's just as reasonable to suppose that as it is to suppose that everyone, or even someone, hates you, envies you, doesn't love you, or anything else along that line. You have the power to decide whether you are loved or not loved. That means you have the power to decide that everybody loves you no matter what they do. Wow. Think about that one. That means you could decide to interpret whatever happens as a sign of love. And no matter what anybody did, that they were loving you the best way they could. And this would give you tremendous freedom to love back. And would also have the effect of freeing you from any kind of tension or fearfulness in regard to other people or their actions. And if you don't have anything, if you're not resisting anything they're doing, they're going to be doing good to you. And if you are constantly thinking of other people as loving people, you will find yourself in your life surrounded by people who are helping you to enjoy life. In other words, if you don't put any conditions and somebody's beating you with a stick, well, okay, they may be loving you, but that's not very enjoyable. But if you start developing a situation in which you believing that everybody's loving you, regardless of what they do, you're not putting any conditions up or resisting what they do, you're going to find fewer and fewer people doing things that are not enjoyable. How you interpret it, how you interpret your life. is completely up to you, and how you interpret it will determine, to a large degree, what you experience. So think on that one. Examine your own rules. See whether you want to keep them, change them, or throw them out. That's up to you. Aloha.